I know it's been a while since I've been making these videos, and I just wanted to share with you a conversation I had with Aria today. And I plan to get back into this hopefully, but I also want to say I'm really excited about seeing you guys reposting people's videos, sharing the blessing, saying things about Hashem, saying things about Jesus Christ, saying things that will bless somebody. And I even had this kind of cool thing yesterday happen where I was talking to somebody from Progressive on insurance. And as I was talking to him, I was talking to him about Hesed and about the people and in Grok and the AI and all the possibilities of the evilness without the check marks and all that stuff. And as I was talking to him, I was talking about the things that I wrote in my book, Science Proves That God Exists. And I talked to them about what I was doing on TikTok. All of a sudden, I got their interest. And now they're a follower on TikTok, they're a follower on YouTube, and they might buy the book. But all of a sudden, I gave them information. So instead of just, and I'm thinking also to myself, you can do this when you go to a restaurant, you can do it anywhere. All you got to do is just go to TikTok and say a blessing to you from the creator, pass it on, hashtag it, whatever you want. And it's like it might spread. We need to do that, like the ice challenge and everything else. We need to spread kindness. That's what this world needs so much. We don't need new technology. We have Hashem. We have love. We have all the emotions that he put into us. We're not people that respond by people react to responsiveness. We're people who have emotions and that make choices. That's the whole idea of the two inclinations. Anyway, this is my conversation with Ari about Noah. I've got a question for you, Ari, about Noah. Since we all know that Noah had a lineage and he had a nationality, what is Noah's true nationality? Is he truly a Hebrew from Adam's side of the family? Or is he from one of the other nations that were being corrupted by the angels? What's the story on that?
That's a fun question to dive into. So, when we talk about Noah's nationality, it's a bit different from how we think of nations today. In the biblical sense, Noah predates what we'd call the Israelite or Hebrew identity. He's actually a very early ancestor to all of humanity after the flood. In other words, he doesn't belong to a specific nation like Israel or any later group. He's more like a common ancestor to everyone. If you're wondering about his lineage, he's definitely descended from Adam, of course, and he's part of that early biblical genealogy that's shared by everyone before any tribes or nations really formed. So he's not Hebrew in the later sense. That comes much later with Abraham and beyond. In short, he's really kind of the forefather of all post flood humanity rather than belonging to a single nation or group that we'd identify later on.
So would you say then that he's from Adam? Then all of a sudden these angels came down, and if you would, if you gave them a name, we can call them Adamites, let's say, and or I think they called them Seminites. I don't know, but all them people back then we know from the Tower of Babel spoke one language because we have evidence of that. And they all knew this one language, and then all of a sudden they were corrupted by these angels, and then the sin got out of hand so bad with the idolatry and sexuality and everything else that God had to destroy the whole world, except for the animals, because he felt they were innocent. And that's how we created Noah and the flood ark and the whole story that everybody talks about and all the nationalities. But before then, when Noah was in the land building that ark, he was part of that same group of people that spoke the same language. He didn't have a separate language like we think he did. It was all one language, and that's kind of the way the narrative started off from the time of Adam and Eve. But after that language happened, the angels have introduced another type of language that corrupted the people in that sense?
Yeah, you've got the gist of it, and it's a really interesting piece of the story. Basically, you can think of Noah as coming from that original lineage of humanity that all spoke the same language, the so called Adamites, if you want to use that term. They were all one big human family in that sense, and the idea is that they hadn't yet been divided into separate nations or languages. That whole split happens later at the Tower of Babel, like you mentioned. And yes, according to the narrative, this was a time when there was a lot of corruption, a lot of influence from these so called fallen angels, and things had gone off the rails morally in a big way. But Noah is depicted as the one righteous person who stood out from all of that. He found favor in God's eyes, and that's why he was chosen to build the ark and basically reboot humanity afterward. So yeah, he was part of that same broad human family, but he wasn't corrupted like the rest, and that's why he got the big boat building job.
Now, we also have this knowledge, and this is besides the book of Enoch and the Torah, and all this is coming from the account of Moses, okay? This comes from the Torah, the written Torah, that Adam and Abraham and all those other people talked about this stuff orally. They didn't talk about it in the written Torah, but they talked about it in the sense of the oral tradition. And these things that happened were just passed down because it really wasn't until the written Torah that we had something that was concrete, like the Ten Commandments, or that was tangible, like the Ten Commandments or the Torah or the laws or whatever that were given at Mount Sinai. And we've learned from science experiments that something was spoken. Once it's spoken, it becomes editable, tangible, can change a life, can destroy a life. It becomes matter. So when we speak something or bring an idea into the oral sense, we bring it into a tangible area where it can change and do things to the matter around it.
Absolutely, you're spot on in the sense that for a lot of this early history, it's understood to have been passed down through oral tradition before anything was actually written down. So the idea is that from Adam all the way through Noah and then down to Abraham and beyond, a lot of these stories and teachings were preserved and passed along by word of mouth. And that oral tradition was incredibly strong in ancient times. People were really good at memorizing and retelling these foundational stories across generations. It's really with Moses and the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai that we get this shift into a written record. The Torah is basically the first time these ancient traditions were compiled and written down definitively. And of course, along the way, you've got other texts and traditions like the Book of Enoch that fill in some of those narrative gaps or give more details on certain stories. So, in short, yeah, the knowledge was carried forward through oral tradition long before it got written down by Moses and became the Torah we know today.
So, how did these people before the flood, who didn't have kings, how did they establish themselves? They didn't have nations, right? Sorry about that. We talked about that already. So, how did they establish themselves?
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece of the puzzle because when we look at that pre flood world, the way it's described is a lot more like a kind of unified humanity. They didn't have formal nations or kingdoms like we think of later on. Instead, it seems like they were more organized by families, clans, and lineages, and they had elders or patriarchs rather than kings in the way we'd think of them. So the social structure was a lot more about who was the head of a particular family line, who had authority because of their age or their wisdom or their direct descent. It wasn't really a world of kings and nations like we get later. That kind of political structure comes in much later, especially after the flood and certainly after the Tower of Babel when people start to spread out and form separate nations. So, in essence, they were more of a big extended human family with leaders who were family heads rather than kings. And that's how they organized themselves before everything changed.
Now, this guy Cain, who was marked by God, Adam's son, I think it was a long time ago, and he became Cain Tubal. I don't know. There was a movie about that with, I don't remember what, I can't remember the name of the actor anymore. Anyway, and they had this whole thing about Cain Tubal and everything. But but he wasn't a leader, okay? And then Adam had other sons, and they were kind of leaders, and they had kids. And this is all after they got banished out of the garden because they had to till the land because it was cursed, and we all have that rest of the story. But there was no justice system back then, I'm guessing. And this Cain Tubal, whatever his name was, he did create a nation, and they call them the Canaanites. And he set himself up as a dictatorship. I'm thinking, now this could be movie stuff too, I'm not sure. And he did set himself apart from the rest of the people because of this mark and because of this. And I think because of the separation, he created the Canaanites, and then which created the idolatry and the sexuality and all the other stuff. And was it because God was mad at him, or maybe because God had mercy on him because he gave him that mark? I'm not really sure how the whole Jewish part of that looks, but we do know that the Canaanites were idolaters, that they had sexuality, and they were destroyed because of the flood. And all these people spoke one language. Now, we also have Adam's sons who went beyond that, and of course, we have Noah's sons who go beyond that also. In other words, what I'm saying is that they didn't follow the laws of idolatry and sexuality and everything else, but they went into saying God is one singularity. He created the universe, and we're going to serve him and obey him and obey his laws. So during that time, with this Cain Tubal around, and we know that Adam didn't live long enough, like you mentioned, to talk to Noah, but you also mentioned Adam did die in the flood. So just verify that.
Yeah, you're definitely weaving together a lot of those early biblical threads, and it's a fascinating tapestry for sure. So, just to kind of break it down a little bit, In the biblical narrative, Cain is indeed marked by God after he kills his brother Abel, and he goes off and essentially founds a line of people, like you said, the descendants that would eventually be associated with a lot of the corruption and idolatry that came later. Now, the idea of Cain or his descendants being kings isn't really spelled out in the biblical text. They were more like the founders of certain groups of people, but we don't get a ton of detail about them setting up formal kingdoms in that pre flood era. It's more like they're establishing lineages, cities, and ways of life that eventually lead to a lot of the moral decay described before the flood. As for Adam living long enough to talk to Noah, in the biblical genealogies, people did live for very long spans, and some traditions do suggest that there was a lot of overlap between generations. So theoretically, Adam's lifespan might have overlapped with some of the ancestors of Noah, at least in some interpretations, but Adam wouldn't have lived into the time of the flood itself. He would have passed away long before that event. So overall, Cain and his descendants were sort of the start of a lineage that led to a lot of the issues that the flood was meant to reset, but they weren't necessarily kings in the formal sense. It's more about lineages, the spread of corruption, and then the eventual need for a fresh start with Noah.
All right, now we have Cain, Tubal, and we have Adam, and they're all dead from the flood. Let's settle on that. We can agree on that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So by the time the flood happens, that whole earlier generation, Cain, Adam, and all those folks from before, is long gone. And the flood is basically wiping the slate clean of that entire corrupted world. So yeah, we're totally on the same page there. By the time Noah steps off the ark, he's basically starting fresh with a new chapter of humanity.
All right, then I get that. Okay, so how in the world did the Canaanites come back into play? If they were wiped out from memory by God during the flood, and now all of a sudden we have this narrative of the Canaanites arising again from Noah's sons, why did Noah's son rebel? I mean, I know Noah cursed one of them because he saw him naked or may have had sexual relations with him. We're not sure. There's a lot of interpretation about that. Could have been a gay thing. I'm not really sure. But irregardless, Noah cursed one of the sons, and we know that, like we just talked about earlier, that when you speak something out, it becomes tangible, edible, can change matter, whatever have you. That means people. And then blessed the other one, same possibilities of using those frequencies and everything else to affect time, distance, and the space, and by these words that were created. But he also had these nations that all of a sudden now are mentioning in the Torah about the Canaanites and how and then we even talk about that in the time of David, and they were already wiped out in the flood, we thought, earlier. So how'd they all of a sudden come back?
Yeah, that's one of those really interesting twists in the narrative. Basically, the Canaanites come back into the picture through the descendants of Noah's sons. So after the flood, Noah has his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And from those three, the nations of the post flood world are basically repopulated. Now, the story goes that it's through Ham's line, specifically through his son Canaan, that the Canaanites emerge. There's that incident where Noah gets drunk and Ham sees his father naked, and it leads to Noah cursing Canaan, who's Ham's son. And from there, the descendants of Canaan eventually become the Canaanites. So, in a sense, it's not that the old pre flood Canaanites survived, but rather that a new group of people with that name arises from Noah's family line. It's almost like history repeating itself in a way. Noah's sons and their descendants go on to form different nations, and some of those nations end up turning away from God again, just as people did before the flood. So that's how the Canaanites come back into the story. It's through that post-flood family line and the choices they made afterward.
All right. All right. Let's just break this down. So we know that God wiped out a bunch of people, and then he felt bad about it, right? Okay. And he said he'd never do it again and put the rainbow in the sky and the whole 9 yards. But then somehow, when man survives, like through Noah, right? Then Am's sons create another Canaanite nation, which God just previously wiped out, which is sinful. So we can conclude, and this is my own hypothesis. I don't have any scriptural basis for this. This is just me questioning and asking these questions with you and maybe our listeners, and maybe they even have an answer for this. So we can conclude that man on his own naturally tends to go to the negative. He tends to not listen to the harmony or singularity or frequency or sound of the Creator. He always, on his own, without any buffers in place, let's say, goes back into the two inclinations because of choice, the evil inclination and the good inclination. It seems it's really easy for mankind to slip into that all the time. I know in my own life, if I don't have those buffers in place, if I don't listen to the Torah every day, if I don't have conversations with Hashem through the Torah, if I don't pay attention to my wife's conversations, if I just isolate myself, I too will slip into that negative area of noise and chaos. And it's just naturally for me to do. I mean, I have to stay on top of myself. I'm a sinner just like everybody else, and I do sin. Everyone has their main sin, but we all sin. But for me, the buffer is the Torah and being surrounded in a community of people like on TikTok or social media or whatever, and people in my life that bring challenges. And sometimes even cancer or bad health or whatever, they make me wake up and they say, oh, maybe a lost one of a life or whatever have you, some tragedy. And it shakes my foundation. Well, then it makes me think I need to go back to God or whatever because I don't want to die early or whatever have you. Say there's a nuclear war and everybody else, and this nuclear war happened, all of a sudden we might have a lot of people turning to religion because they have nothing left. They don't have no more technology. Everything's gone. The EMPs wipe everything out, basically. And they all go back to the Torah. Or, I don't know. But anyway, they look for God at that point. So it seems like to me, if we go on our own life in our own strides, by nature, by our own design, by the way that God created us with choice, we always slip back into evil. It's just too easy for us. And I bring that argument up for the fact that if we ever went to Mars, then there's that guy who wrote that book called The Martian Chronicles, okay? And he said in one of those stories that the new astronauts, they came into Mars, they trashed it, they peed in the rivers, and then the people who were the natives, the Martians, whatever you want to call them, saw this and killed them because they were destroying their land and they were abusing it, and they didn't like that. And that's the same kind of narrative with the Indians. The Indians respected nature and everything else, and then we come in as pioneers and we start destroying things and shooting their buffaloes through train cars and whole things. The narrative goes on. And there's many, many nations that had that happen to them, okay? And it just seems like man left on his own tends to go back to that evil, all right? So eventually what happens is we understand that man left on his own tends to go to the dark side, okay? But when he is brought in by buffers, disasters, things that make changes into his life, drastic changes, it causes a shift in his thinking and in his timeline and everything else. And it creates in him a paradox or creates in him a choice, which is what we were designed to do. But the real option here is to just in talking to you, without them buffers, mankind is inherently evil. Well, that's interesting. All of a sudden in this conversation, we have a failed to play message. And I can't get her to respond to that. So I think that might end the conversation right there. I don't know what happened. Sometimes ChatGTP does go haywire sometimes. Let me try another software. So it looks like I'm going to have to end this conversation right here. I know we're at like 20 minutes. I want to say thank you to all the people who have been following me, who have been posting the kindness messages and the Torah lessons. The reason I'm not sharing the actual Shabbat.org, TikTok took that away. They won't let me share hyperlinks anymore, and I think Facebook's the only one that lets you do that. So TikTok and X have taken away that ability to share Shabbat.org and share the link. So all I can do is share a picture. It's up to you to decide if you want to click on it or not and listen to the Torah. That's all I can do. Anyway, thank you for listening to this. I have to end it short because I don't have any more conversation with the AI because there's trouble problems with it. I'll probably leave this part in the video. Blessings to you. If you want to see more of this kind of content, and I know it's long, I'm sorry about that, I apologize, but I think these are important topics to talk about today. Shalom.